All right, I am back again. We're doing Apollo 8 and Chapter 5. This is by Jeffrey Kluger. The thrilling story of the first mission to the moon. And this is the giant leap. Uh, and I got my glasses on. Part of the reason why I got my glasses on is this is a serious chapter. This Chapter 5 is basically about Apollo 1 in a sense. And I got a whole other book on that I plan to go through. Um, Those of you who are familiar with Apollo 1 probably know what I'm talking about. Those of you who aren't are about to find out. Um, so, as a reminder, I pause a lot in these videos. Use that as meditation. You can also use it to, be grateful you're alive and be grateful that you can breathe. There's so many things to be grateful about, but also just observe your thoughts. And if you have negative thoughts, figure out how to turn them into positive thoughts. Uh, as I say, the quote, every dark cloud has a silver lining. Um, Sometimes it takes more creativity to discover the silver lining, but it's possible. So, the second level of meditation is to have no thoughts at all, which is probably the highest or the best, one of the best levels of meditation. Um, I also do pause to respect the copyright of this book. And to get the best out of these videos is buy the book, read the chapter before I do the video, before you watch the video. Uh, and so we'll go from here. Um, so this is in January 1967. There's a weird pattern with a lot of fatal space accidents. I'm not sure. Well, at least I know the Columbia and Challenger, the pattern is associated with basically extreme cold weather. Apollo, I don't know. Apollo 1, I don't know if there's any association. Uh, I'd be curious to know if got the book Apollo 1. I'm curious to know when they worked on it. If they worked on it in the cold, I wonder uh, if it was cold outside. I'm kind of curious about that. Uh, but it was built in a different location. So, anyways, so here we go. We're going to chapter 5. And again, as a reminder, I pause, use that as meditation, improve your meditation skills. I have lots of underlining here in this whole chapter, which means the author did a really great job, Jeffrey Kluger. So again, buy the book or check it out from the library for free, and you can go through it with me. Okay, so this is January 1967. I did not exist at this time. I was a non. I was a pattern in the universe that existed before. The beginning of life is like a zinc explosion occurs. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's actually. But what forms a person is the environment, uh, and so we are really kind of reflections of our environment. Wherever we happen to, like, I wouldn't know English if I wasn't born in North America. If I was born in Thailand, I'd be speaking Thai and maybe not know English. so, so a lot of the environment forms our consciousness in a sense. The hardware, the basic hardware exists. That's one thing amazing and extraordinary is just four basic molecules, ATCG, DNA forms the extraordinary complex structure of a body and a mind. But it's just four parts. It's almost like a digital computer. Digital computers even simpler. Zero and one, the basic representations. Even though if it's transistor logic, it's a voltage. It could be like zero point 0.4 volts to zero point 0.7 volts or something like that. Depends on what kind of logic is being used. But logic hardware or transistors, uh, or field effect transistors. But anyways, so let's get to around. So this is page 74 of the book, chapter 5. Uh, so Gus Grissom, he was one of the Apollo 1 astronauts. Uh, he snuck forbidden food into the spacecraft twice in his career. First time, second time was, I forget the definition of portent. Alexa, volume 10. Alexa, define Portent.
Sorry, I don't know that one.
Alexa, define the word Portent.
Portent is usually defined as an indication or omen of something about to happen, especially something momentous. For more,
Okay.
ask me to give you more definitions for portent.
So the first time was out of humor. The second time was has some significance. So the first time is first mate John Young, co-pilot, was the one that brought the food, forbidden food. It was a small crime, and it was a corned beef sandwich, and this is on Gemini 3. I guess there's a sandwich shop in Cocoa Beach. I wonder if that even exists still. It's called Wolfie's Restaurant and Sandwich Shop. I'll make work for myself in the comments to see if that restaurant still exists. Wolfie's Restaurant and Sandwich Shop. I'm tempted to go there and buy a a corned beef sandwich. So this is March 1965, and then yeah, because the astronauts didn't like their mixing water sandwich or food. They had to mix in a bag, water in a bag, and they didn't really like it. It's kind of like reminding me of trying to mix up mortar or something. I'm not really good at mixing concrete or mortar or whatever, but it's a chemistry experiment. Uh, so you have to get the book to get to the commentary on this forbidden food. It's really good little commentary between John Young, and Gus Grissom. Um, so the second time, the forbidden food that was brought in the flight deck was January 22nd, 1967, and this is in the three-man Apollo spacecraft module on the floor of North American Aviation Factory in Downey, California. That's where they were getting built at the time. And this particular time, the forbidden fruit was a lemon. You can actually make a battery from a lemon if you stick like. I'll make it work for myself in the comments, but you can actually generate or get power from a lemon by using like a copper or see electrode and anode, different metals. I think copper, and then I'm not sure what other material for the other electrode. So I'll link you to that in the comments. But anyways, uh, okay, I just got an email that I've got a device that wants to suck my blood, financial blood away. So I'm gonna have to cancel them, install some new piece of hardware. Anyways, that's another topic. That's one thing. I'm gonna insert a financial tip for all you, just for especially those who need food to eat, need money for food or whatever. Or if you're sleeping in a hammock, kind of homeless. Um, any company that wants to charge you on a recurring basis, I highly recommend you fire them unless they provide you real, actual, provide you more income than what it brings in. So this is actually a camera company, and I'm probably going to fire them and replace them with a company that doesn't have a recurring charge. So, uh, anyways, I just got the video, but thankfully they reminded me. I have to give them credit for reminding me. I'm looking at my phone here, and I get a message. It says, "Oh, we're going to charge you X amount of money. Sorry, every for the rest of your life." So, sorry, I'm not going to allow that. So, okay. So, anyways, back to the book. Apologize for that interjection. So Grissom and Ed White and Roger Schaff, those are crewmates, were inside the simulator of the actual Apollo spacecraft, which was known as Spacecraft 204, but would soon be renamed Apollo 1 in preparation for the February 21st, 1967 liftoff. And this Spacecraft 204 was going to be the first flight for Apollo. On the surface, it looked like a beautiful ship, appeared to be robust and most capable spacecraft, quote unquote. But those were misleading. This reminds me of Titanic. Have you ever seen the movie Titanic? I'll link you guys to the movie in the comments. It's a great movie, and it's also a great example of hubris and the Dunning-Kruger effect. So, whenever somebody says something's unsinkable or impossible to fail, you want to put a big question mark on it right away. In fact, probably even more so than somebody who says you have X probability of that death. Everything has a probability. If I walk like 10 meters to this direction, I could be hit by a meteorite and disappear, turn into an invisible man. Uh, so we can all die at any moment, any time. But the probability is extremely low that a meteorite would hit me. Maybe somebody could probably calculate it, like one in millions or 10 to the minus ninth or something like that. So, but anyways, it's all probabilities. And that's another thing about machine intelligence. It's based on probabilities or reinforcement learning, especially. Um, Now, from the perspective of the astronauts, the Apollo 1 was air prone, had lots of problems, and very difficult to work with, and something that seemed to break almost all the time. And so technicians would have to crawl in, decide when something wouldn't work, and there's a faulty communication system or dead panel or some other component. And so the astronauts knew that if these failed in space, it could kill them. So it's very serious. Uh, but the repairs that were made were kind of patchwork affairs and workarounds. Um, so they made fixes on top of fixes, and who knows if they're, I don't know if they're, hopefully in Apollo 1 book we'll talk about if they're keeping track of how they're tracking this. Uh, Instead of when there was a problem, they didn't take out the offending design and analyze what exactly caused the problem. Um, and then redesigning, reinstalling. And so the original Apollos didn't earn the same confidence level as Mercury and Gemini from the astronauts' perspective. And Gus Grissom was disgusted by this, and he would complain to the technicians and their bosses, and then NASA's bosses, and they all would claim to promise to have these fixed. But the Apollo spacecraft got no better. So it got so bad that Gus Grissom used an alternative method to try to express himself, and that was using the lemon. And so he left the lemon on the perch atop it before walking silently away. I don't know if there's any pictures of that. I'll try to see if there is any pictures of it and put it in the comments. Um, so there may have been a conflict. I mean, there's some kind of communications failure between the astronauts and the engineers, quote unquote engineers at that point. Um, there's a lot of details like how many Geminis flew on page 76. Get the book to get those details. So both the key thing here is the Mercuries and Geminis were built by McDonald Aircraft in St. Louis, and they did a good job. But McDonald Aircraft knew the employees knew that NASA was both not only their customer but also their boss. But for Apollo to add an additional spacecraft, but McDonald could not take on the extra work, and so he had to go outside McDonald Aircraft. And apologize for disappearing here. I really kind of need to adjust my image background setting if I can. um, so So they ended up choosing a company called North American Aviation, and the problem with this choice was their key focus was really not on piloted machines. They were basically their focus was on dumb machines that had no humans on board, basically, and so they didn't have the skill set for man and machine interface, and so that was a huge deficit. So Frank Borman ended up going to North American after the Gemini 7 marathon mission of 2 weeks in space. The two, let's see. So early on, the Borman got to go inside this Apollo simulator and was really displeased, exceedingly displeased by what he saw. Um, First thing he noticed, the yoke was upside down, or that actually fire. Let's see, the hand controller, yeah, was upside down. So when he pulled back, the nose went down, and so and pushed forward, the ship pointed up. So this is exactly opposite of intuition, the way airplanes work, and the way the Gemini spacecraft did too. So Borman complained about this, and then the quote unquote engineer responded brightly saying that, "Oh no, that's the way we're going to fly it, and it makes rendezvous easier when you pull back on the stick." Okay, so the engineer not having any. This is an example of Dunning Kruger effect. It's like there's no humility. There's he was missing humility. Borman was speechless when this happened. And the presumptuous use of the word "we" as if there was any question about exactly who would be flying the spacecraft. And so the quote unquote engineer completely dismissed the, the experience of the pilots. The engineer, the quote unquote engineer, made a huge assumption uh, without any experience at all. And again, it's like I said, this example is Dunning Kruger effect. It's overconfidence and lack of humility. You can't learn anything if you have no humility. I mean, humility has high value. The problem is we have the sometimes the people that have the most confidence rise to the top of the hierarchy and then screw everything up. So instead of the reverse, where you have the person with the least confidence who's the most intelligent move to the top of the hierarchy. But sometimes, sadly, it takes a fire for that to occur and death, but um, early death. And so Borman basically said, I'm going to quote a quote, well, that maybe the way you're going to do it, sitting on your ass as an engineer, quote unquote engineer. He snapped, but that's not the way we're going to do it. And so, I mean, Borman is really the captain, the skipper of the operation, and the engineer is being insubordinate to the skipper in a sense. It's important that the skipper has engineering skills. I mean, that's real engineering skills. I think But even more important is the skipper has application skills, applying the skills. But Borman was able to fix at least the thrust control interface, human machine interface, and that was fixed. And speed was taken as priority over safety. And that's one of my. There's a phrase that called haste makes waste. Haste can also kill. So if you read the Deep Survivor Theory series by Lawrence Gonzalez, one of his acronyms is STOP. Stop, think, observe, and plan. Um, I think what it sounds like what was going on is they had a problem, but they didn't stop and think and observe and plan, and more just kind of just fixed, not even stop. Um, so Chris Kraft ended up going to the floor at Downey and having his own quiet location. So Chris Kraft called on John Bailey, a former boss at NACA, when before NASA, and so Bailey did a report and said it was bleak. Uh, each subsystem was a cause for concern, and that the hardware is not very good. Cabling is being stepped on when they work on a spacecraft. There's no protection for it. People are not very good at checking this thing out. They're not very good at trying to maintain some semblance of the fact that a human being is going to be in this machine. I'm telling you, it's not good. This is about on page 79. This kind of reminds me of like we have codes, electrical codes. They're called National Electrical Code, like in the United States. It's basically exists to keep people from killing themselves or killing somebody else uh, through electrocution or fire. Um, but if it's not respected, then the probability of death increases. Uh, like say if you don't have the right grounding, or if you defeat the grounding systems. Congress was growing increasingly reluctant to fund the moon program, and it was pouring money into the widening war in Vietnam. So that's another thing. If we didn't have the Vietnam War, maybe Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Schaff would not be burnt to a crisp, or might be alive today. But then again, we may have not gone to the moon because we didn't have a quality control. But it's you know, and there people could argue the opposite too. If we didn't fund the money from NASA and focused it on Vietnam, so it just war just not. I mean, the technological benefits of war are great, but the the death and the just injuries and all of those horrible things to human flesh, no matter what side you're on, that's very unproductive. Uh, So Gus Grissom had experience in both Mercury and Gemini. Uh, he's one of the few men that had the experience level, and so Chris Kraft and Bailey hoped that he would be a good choice for this. Ed White had flown a single time in Gemini 4 in 1965. He did the spacewalk. Previous video, I linked you guys to the spacewalk. It's really amazing to look at. You look at it, it's like you're flying through space. I mean, you just your legs like miles and miles below your feet. It's just atmosphere, space, and for the ground is below. Reminds me of the song "Earthbound Misfit," uh, learning to fly. The lyric "Earthbound Misfit," learning to fly. But Pink Floyd. I'll link you guys to that in the comments. But those 23 minutes in the spacewalk that Ed White did were brutal. He was struggling against zero G physics, and he had to get back inside safely. The hatch refused to close for a full 5 minutes, and then he had to rely on sheer muscle to yank it shut, exerting himself so much that he fogged his visor completely. And the astronaut with no experience, Roger Schaff, no experience in spaceflight, but he did have a lot of pilot flying experience. Roger Schaff had been a Navy pilot and flown reconnaissance missions over the missile sites in Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that was a conflict with the Soviets. So there's a picture of Ed White, Gus Grissom, and Roger Schaff in front of this Apollo spacecraft, smiling in uh, counterfeit uh, confidence in front of the camera. And then there's another photograph. I've seen both of these photographs. I'll link you to both in the comments. There's a second one that, at the time, didn't get circulated, but Grissom, White, and Schaff are shown posed with their hands together praying. Um, and to make sure that message got sent to the right individuals, they wrote to Harrison, quote, "Stormy Storms," the North American engineer who was overseeing the Apollo project. And they wrote, quote, "Stormy," unquote. The inscription read, quote, "This time we're not calling Houston," unquote. In other words, they're talking to the invisible magic being in the sky, so to speak, depending on your belief system. Um, yeah, so disasters. It's usually not one thing that kills people. It's usually like a confluence of almost an infinite number of things that come together, and there's a lot of them can be pre alarm signals. Can if you can catch them before the dominoes, it's like dominoes. So all these dominoes have to be lined up, and but if you can stop it before it happens, that's hard. And the safety engineer's got one of the hardest jobs in the world because uh, you can get blamed for the death of people, or you can get blamed for delaying the project. And it's really like playing goalie. It's like you're the goalie. Uh, the only thing that can happen is negative. I mean, you either stop the ball or the ball goes into the goal against your team. Uh, and so it's kind of a thankless job to be a safety engineer. But you have to be able to say no. And even if it means losing your job, to say no. Uh, and one of the other problems of like industry is regulatory capture, where the corporation captures the regulator, so the regulator is not independent anymore. And that's a recent example of that failures with the FAA in the U.S. with a certain model aircraft, commercial aircraft that had two crashes. On January 27th, 1967. This is 5 days after Grissom put the lemon on the spacecraft. And this is less than a month before the Apollo 1 scheduled launch. And so they were about to conduct what was called a plugs out test. And they would get fully suited in their gear, their spacesuits, and climb into the spacecraft, which is already on the pad mounted on top of its Saturn 1B booster. And at this point, the spacecraft operated an internal power system. I'm really curious about what the temperature was when they were doing this test outside ambient temperature. And so these tests, they try to do their best to emulate the real thing, the real uh, actual actual application. And so they had 100% oxygen instead of 22% oxygen, 78% nitrogen mix of Earth's atmosphere. So the designers assumed that they only needed oxygen and that inert nitrogen tanks were not necessary. They're just adding extra weight. There's a quote, and I've heard this before. It's to assume is to make an ass out of you and an ass out of me. That spells assume. And so it's really important to state your assumptions and understand your assumptions. If you don't state your assumptions, and what's the worst thing that can happen based on your assumption? Um, and so this is kind of this basic chemistry. If you have high amount of oxygen, it makes a high potential for a fire. Much higher potential than when there's less oxygen. But they also had interior pressure, which was higher to prevent the outside air from damaging the hull of a low pressure spacecraft. And so they inflated it to 16.8 pounds per square inch inside. And so this is a again this is one of many factors that contributed to the fatalities. The second situation was the hatch, which was to the back of the astronauts. Once they're inside, it's behind them and directly over them, and in this case, is over Ed White's head. And in an emergency, the hatch needs to open very quickly. And but when there's such high internal pressure, it makes it harder to open. And they designed a double hatch, there's an inner one and an outer hatch, so it's even more complicated and sealed with multiple latches. And so, if an emergency occurred, the person in the center seat, which is Ed White, would have to open the latches with a ratchet. A ratchet. So they had a special tool even to open the hatch, and then detach the inner hatch and pull it in and lay it down the floor. And then only then could the outer hatch be opened. So the commander in the left hand seat would also need to assist if needed. So they Ed White, Gus Grissom, Roger Shaft practiced this sequence many times, and no matter how hard or efficiently they worked, it took time. And it'd be interesting in the Apollo 1 book if they documented how long it took to try to open that hatch design. So the night before the plugs out test, Gus Grissom and Wally Schreier went to the launch pad and spent some time inside the spacecraft running some final tests. And when Grissom climbed out, he shook his head and he said something about this ship just doesn't ring right. And I don't know if these are true, how accurate these quotes are. On page 82 of the author, I don't know how accurate the quotes are. If this is in some documentation somewhere or not, I'd be curious to know. But and then Schreier added a warning. He'd quote, "If you have any problems, I'd get out." And then Grissom promised he would. So at 2:50 p.m., Ed White, Gus Grissom, Roger Shaft, on January 27, 1967, climbed into the climbed into their seats in the Apollo 1 spacecraft on top of the platform, on top of the rocket. Probably wasn't fueled at the time because this is a test. And so the double hatch had been closed and sealed. And one of the key problems that occurred in earlier tests was bulky communications. There was a storm of static in the communication systems. And Gus Grissom's communications line, for reasons the quote unquote engineers couldn't manage to discover, was even worse. So I'm looking at this as like a lot of times when you have noise on communication lines, it's can be an indication of potentially there's poor grounding. If the system isn't properly grounded, you can end up having all kinds of noise. Because what happens is what's called floating voltages, which introduce noise. That alone is, and there's really a weird thing that's said here. I'll go get to it once we get to it here. Deke Slayton offered to climb into underneath the crew, underneath the seats during this test, during the entire test period, uh, to see if he could help solve this communications problems. But the test was supposed to be closer to what the actual mission was going to be, and so having a fourth person in there would make it less of that type of test. But Deke Slayton uh, could have been fatally part of this. So at 6:20 p.m. So we know the test started at 2:50 p.m. They're at 6:20 p.m. Exhausted crew and exhausted ground teams working at Cape Kennedy in Florida, Mission Control in Houston got a short break from a simulated countdown and went to what's called a 10-minute hold while the communications breakdown and other glitches were addressed. So Chris Kraft was going back and forth in Mission Control office and now has settled down at his desk. And then Gus Grissom spoke in the radio, how are we going to get to the moon if we can't even talk between three buildings? See, that's a really strong indication of. So when you see a problem on something, it may be considered minor. Oops, I'm disappearing. Minor, but then it's almost like the tip of an iceberg. It's like, okay, that's the surface information, maybe an indication of all kinds of other problems elsewhere. And Gus Grissom, his intuition was right. The problem is, didn't act on it in time. Just a few seconds shy of 6:30 p.m., one of the rare moments in his voice got through clearly, and that's what he said. And then Ed White said, "They can't hear a thing you're saying," said Ed White. 1 minute and 14 seconds later, people on the ground did hear something the crew was saying. What they heard was Chaff shouting, "Hey!" This is Roger Chaff. Next, they heard White screaming, "Fire! We've got a fire in the cockpit." Then they heard Chaff shouting, "We have a bad fire." And finally, they heard Chaff again, this time screaming, "We're burning up." And then the technicians in the white room outside the spacecraft could see in the windows motion and flickering light of what was unmistakably a fire. And Donald Babbitt yelled out, "Get them out of there." He was the pad leader. So they leapt towards the spacecraft and began wrestling frantically with the hatch. Tense heat was radiating with the metal hull, forced them to turn their faces to avoid the full power of it. Crew egress called Chuck Gay, the lead test conductor. Below the hatch shouted Gary Props, communications technician nearby. "Why don't they blow the hatch?" They knew that the spacecraft was in danger of exploding. Moments later, the Apollo gave off a sound of a blast of air like a bomb, showering the White Room with flaming debris and setting a fire to loose papers on clipboards and desks. Inside the spacecraft, the fire rushed towards the freedom of the opening, completely engulfing the astronauts. There would be no surviving that. The crew was lost. Chris Kraft heard it all. Slayton heard it all. One of the astronauts, a professional pilot, the last man who knew that as long as you're able to communicate with your flight controllers, you must keep them apprised of the condition of your ship, saying, as lovely as circumstances would allow, I'm reporting a bad fire. The report was duly noted. Speaking of a bad fire, it's kind of hot outside, and I have a cat I'm house sitting, so I'm gonna let her in because she's making some sounds. So just hold on a second. Okay, sometimes it can get pretty hot in the desert, so not that hot, but uh, so that reminds me of I used to sit next to a guy that I was working with, who's telling me about this about some of the pilots who were in an aircraft that was just gonna it was crashing, and they just report what they saw on their instruments on the way down, and that's all they could do, and they died. But they did their job to the last second, and last picosecond, which is really admirable. And what can you do? I mean, uh, so I remember working with a guy talking about that. Um, so within the hour, NASA announced their deaths of Ed White, Gus Grissom, and Roger Schaff. Um, but the to the public they said they died instantly, but it was actually about 21 seconds, judging by biometric readings. It's really like 21 seconds of hell, probably, pretty much. I mean, or it's like a lot of people get cremated in life. It's like, when you're already dead, it's furnace probably feels, you don't feel anything at furnace. But yeah, this is like being burnt alive. Uh, but it was really it probably died of not being able to breathe. Uh, and they pointed, the authors of this book point out, or Jeffrey Kluter, that there was equal parts tragedy and disgrace at the same time, because it was a lot of factors contributed to the fatalities. I mean, having a hatch you can't open easily, having too much oxygen in the spacecraft environment, 100% oxygen, extremely flammable. It's like having a bomb ready to go off. So, and Deke Slayton might have became very close to being part of that, uh, dying in the fatal accident, because he even volunteered to go underneath them in the seats to help diagnose the communications problem. Gene Kranz, one of the top flight directors in NASA, was not at mission control that night because he went. He's having dinner with his wife. We had a third child together, but he's working like a 7 day a week schedule, trying to get his team ready. So that one night, he promised his wife Martha to change, have a change to take her out for dinner at the restaurant, or choosing, and so Krantz had left the space center early to go home to get ready for the dinner he's having with his wife Martha. But before he was done, there was a pounding on his door. Thinking it was a babysitter, he hurried downstairs to get to the door, and he was told there's been an accident at Cape. I think the crew is. I heard on the radio. I think the crew is dead. So out of breath, Krantz was rushed to the mission control center, and to the scene that chilled him. Uh, so in the room, the mission control, there's a lot of young guys, 26, haven't experienced death that much, and now they know. Now they understood they were playing. They were participating in a game of fatal or mortal stakes. Book letting, book learning, and bloodletting were two different experiences, and this time the space program was suffering badly, or bleeding badly. And so they were instructed to leave all their switch and dial remain exactly in the position when the fire struck. Somewhere in all those settings might be critical information for the investigation. And this is what Apollo 1 book hopefully will talk about the investigation. Um, at some point, I'll hopefully do a video series on that. Uh, So not long after this bleak investigation, forensic preparation investigation, the controllers all left as one and all head towards a bar called the Singing Wheel. And I'm going to link you guys in the comments. I'm really curious about this bar. It's favored by NASA personnel. I don't know if it still exists or not. Older hands call the place the Red Barn. So Lyle, a guy named Lyle worked there behind the bar. He knew what was going on, and so all the regular other patrons left, got them to leave, so they had some private time together and have the place to themselves. And so they basically drunk their sorrows away with alcohol. Lyle let them stay for as long as they needed to, closing up only after the last of them struggled home to grieve alone. Even though Ed White, Gus Gus, and Roger Shafts went through 21 seconds of hell, I think the people around suffer in a way more uh, after such a tragedy happens. But so that test was on Friday. Friday's probably not a good day for a serious test or serious anything because people are kind of have the weekend on their mind, and so they're not really fully, present. Uh, like my like during surgery, you probably want surgery on Tuesday at 10 a.m. I hear this is probably the best time to have a surgery if you ever had to have surgery or anything serious. Uh, the weekends can mangle up work in certain ways. Um, Cat's attacking me. Uh, so they called a meeting at Building 30 manned spacecraft ground center grounds. Attendance was mandatory. At this point, they didn't really know exactly what happened, and so Hodge spoke first. And then Krantz took over. And too often he said that too many people said, quote unquote, that can't happen. It's just like the Titanic. They say, oh, this is unsinkable. You have to be honest and say there's a probability because you don't really know everything. Pretty much everything is a probability. And it goes back to the Dunning-Kruger effect. So, what is the very best thing to do in the situation? So it's not good enough to ask what you would accept. Instead, you had to ask what action you would take today to prevent the failure from ever happening. The answer you gave should always satisfy one final question: what is the very best thing to do in the situation? So that's one thing I look at is like, yeah, look at what's the worst thing that's going to happen, then what things can you do to prevent that from happening, and focus on how you make it so what is the best thing to happen in this situation. And that's why we have circuit breakers. Circuit breaker panels, like if you have a short circuit, you don't want the wire to start a fire, so you want to stop the current going through the wire before the fire starts, and that's the whole idea behind circuit breakers and fuses. So Krantz is saying we had the opportunity to call it off. We had the opportunity to say this isn't right. Let's shut it down, and none of us did. And it goes back to Deep Survivor books of Lawrence Gonzalez, where you'd say in the acronym STOP, basically stop, think, observe, and plan. I like to say stabilize, think, observe, and plan. But if you're in flight, um, so Krantz turned to the blackboard and wrote the words tough and competent. I want every one of you to go back to your offices and write these words on top of your own blackboards. You're not to erase them until we put a man on the moon. Tough and competent. It's interesting. So it was decided to bury the astronauts, the three astronauts, Ed White, Gus Grissom, and Roger Schaff, in Arlington National Cemetery, where John F. Kennedy is buried. I've been there actually. Uh, I walked by and you can see the flame, uh, burning flame of where his grave is at JFK's grave. Um, but Ed White wanted to have nothing to do with Arlington. Uh, Ed White was a West Point graduate. So Borman uh, had to call up to try to get Ed White's wishes, family's wishes, to have him buried at West Point, and so I guess Roger Schaff and Gus Grissom are buried in Arlington National Cemetery, and Ed White is at West Point. It'd be interesting to visit those grave sites. I mean, I may have been. I mean, so I've been to Arlington, but I didn't go look specifically for Gus Grissom and Roger Schaff. But now I'm tempted to go there, go back there and see if I can see that, or Ed White's site in West Point. There's also T-38 astronaut pilots of T-38. There's two T-38 crashes. Uh, One was a bird strike, and the other one that crashed into the hangar during the fog, uh, where they happened to be building lunar modules, lunar excursion modules. So the medical examiner determined they died of asphyxiation. And so the smoke and fumes made it impossible for them to breathe. So that's what killed them the quickest, probably. So Gus Grissom had been found partly on his left-hand couch and partly slumped over towards White in the center, suggesting that when he died, he was performing his part in the evacuation drill by leaning over to assist White as he tried to open the latches of the hatch. And White died in his own couch doing that work with one arm dropped across his face as if he were trying to prevent himself from the poisonous smoke that had filled the ship. Roger Shaft, too, was still in his seat. His assignment would have been to maintain radio contact with the ground throughout the escape, the likely reason his voice was heard last. So Borman, doing part of the investigation, saw the plastic drop cloths were been inside the over the instrument panels to protect them for the investigation. Mechanical necroscopy. Alexa, define the word necropsy.
From Grammarist.com. Strictly speaking, the word necropsy is a synonym of autopsy and may be used to mean the examination of any body after death, including a human body.
So this place, the spacecraft was kind of considered like a body too. So they had deconstruction for several months, and the work would reveal the exact sequence of small, avoidable problems that had led to the tragedy on the launch pad. So at precisely 6:31 p.m., a spark jumped from a wire on the far left of the spacecraft beneath Gus Grissom's seat. The wire ran beneath a little storage compartment with a metal door. I'm on page 794. So I ran beneath a little storage compartment with a metal door that had been opened and closed many times without anybody noticing that each time the door moved, it abraded a little more of the wire's insulation, finally leaving the exposed copper free to spark at will. The wire did spark during the plug out test. It ignited a small fire that stayed small for only a second or two. Accelerated by the pure oxygen, the flames climbed along the left hand wall of the spacecraft, feeding on fabric and netting such used for storage. That was the worst possible place for a fire to erupt, since it prevented Grissom from reaching a latch that would have opened a valve and vented the high pressure atmosphere, thus slowing the flames. Fed in the spacesuits of men themselves, spreading from Grissom towards White, who by now was struggling with the helpless Ratchet in the locked tight hatch. As temperatures climbed inside the ship, the pressure gauges, whose readings were being recorded by a computer, rose from 16.8 pounds to 18 and 20 seconds later to soar to explosive 30. They don't say what the temperature of the spacecraft inside was, but the temperature probably rised really fast too. Once it hit 30 pounds per square inch, the spacecraft exceeded the structural limits and it ruptured. And of course, all space flights were suspended um, for all the Apollo spacecraft. So Borman had to go back to the Downey factory floor. But it was far too late to sack North American aviation and start with a new contractor. Instead, the place had to be reformed. So Wally Schur quoted, "You roasted 3 men in that thing already," unquote. He would snap at anyone on the floor Downey who objected to interference from an astronaut. Quote, "You're not going to roast me," unquote. So Borman said to have someone fire Scott Crossfield, the legendary test pilot, being the first human being to reach twice the speed of sound. Had come to work for North American before the fire as part of the quality assurance team. But one of the civilian contractors came apart as well, succumbing to the pressure of too much work, too little sleep, and knew how much grief and guilt. Attended a meeting in North American office one day. He began, to the horror of the other attendees, drawing an organizational chart of heaven, taking care to include a position he labeled, quote, Big Daddy, unquote. An ambulance was summoned and the man was collected and carried away. So the Apollo spacecraft then slowly had to be redesigned and rebuilt. And the hatch needed to be able to open by one person in seconds instead of multiple people. Special tools. Flammable Velcro was eliminated. Every shred of ordinary paper was replaced by fireproof paper. Every scrap of ordinary cloth was replaced by fireproof beta cloth. Combustible coolants was replaced. Soldering joints were reworked. Vibrational tests were improved. 100% oxygen atmosphere used, and the pad was replaced by 60-40 nitrogen oxygen mix. Every single step of quality control and checkout process was also rethought and redrafted. And most important of all, the engineers and human factors people at North American would never be allowed to slip the leash of the space agency, NASA. Nobody's going to put anything on this spacecraft unless NASA management approves it, said Borman. And so, from North American's perspective, Borman was NASA management. And that's the end of this chapter. That was pretty much like a summary of Apollo 1. There's a whole book on that I hope to read at some point. Next chapter is chapter 6. Um, yeah, chapter 5 is tragic. Uh, bottom line is we're all gonna die, just hopefully later rather than sooner. So, uh, but yeah, it's part of that's Dunning Kruger effect. I say if somebody acts overconfident, you really want to question them. Um, so, anyways, I hope you guys are doing great, and I can do a whole other chapter because I read far ahead, so maybe I'll do another video tonight. I don't know. So I hope you're doing great wherever you are, and hope you learned something, uh, especially humility. Um, and you guys, I'll talk to you later. Right? Hope to see you next chapter. Right. Bye.